You're listening to the Ant Pod Care Guide Edition. Your host, Ant Oliver.
Thank you for the introduction, Lexi, and hello and welcome back to the Ant Pod Care Guide Edition. Today we are talking about Carebara Diversa, and before I start, I want to say that this podcast can also be heard as an audio only. Link will be shown in the description. Today, in the panel, we have Ant's Hood, Sid from Makushi, and finally Jake from Antimatters as the panelist. Hood is known for his YouTube channel, where he makes videos on his multiple different ant colonies. And can we get an hello, Hood?
Hello, everyone. This is Ant's Hood, just so you know what my voice sounds like.
Lovely. Next to Hood, we have Sid, who is known for having the company Wakushi, which is a specialized ant-selling product company. Say hello, Sid.
Hello, guys.
Hello to you, Sid. And lastly, we have our regular pod host, Jake, who is known for his YouTube channel, where he weekly recaps what have happened in the ant community, while also documenting some of his own ants. Say hello, Jake.
Hello, everyone.
Hello to you, Jake. And so, of course, these guys are not chosen at random. No, all of our panelists today have a very strong, or at least had some strong Carebara Diversa colonies. And before we start, I want to hear a little bit about your colonies before we get into the care guide itself. So, Hood, what is your experience with Carebara Diversa?
I've had mine for just over a year, and to tell you the truth, at the moment, they're being quite manageable. I've learnt my experiences from my Solenopsis, where they grew too quickly for me, and these guys are making sure that I've got plenty of outworld space and plenty of nest space for them. So, yeah, at the moment, it's been enjoyable, but I do know the reputation of these ants with their wanting to escape and being very escape pro, shall we say. So I'm mindful, but at the moment, it's been a good experience for me.
And how many times have you tried keeping the species?
This is my second attempt to actually keep the species. My first attempt failed miserably because they arrived with mites and I put them in a naturalistic setup. And then once the mites got into that high humidity environment with natural soils, they just decimated my colony.
Yeah, I've dealt with mites with Carebara Diversa. It's not so good. But how big is your colony today?
Well, this is up for debate because I am notoriously bad at estimating numbers, which obviously Sid can testify because he got my Solenopsis colony. When I estimated the whole colony to be around 50,000, he told me there was about 50,000 in the nests I sent him, and there was a good couple of tens of thousands that were still in the outworld when I sent it off. But I would guess that this colony, initially I guessed at 5,000 in my next video, but people have said, no, it's about double that. So I'm going to say around 10,000 now. And
what kind of setup do they live in then?
Mine are in a artificial setup. Controversial for this species because I know the common consensus with them is they've got to be a naturalistic. But because of my YouTube channel and wanting to film them, and not only that though, I wanted to make it more to prove that they could be more accessible for everybody out there because not everyone's got a space for naturalistic setup or can look after that per se. So I wanted to try it in a artificial setup. And to tell you the truth, 10,000 in just over a year, I think I've pulled it out of the bag.
Definitely, it is not a bad story. Jake, you are also a keeper of Carebara Diversa. What is your experience with this species?
Well, I'm keeping my girls. I've gone the traditional way and headed in the natural direction. So they're in a nice big tank. Yeah, that's about it really. They've got plenty of soil, plenty of plants. I'm quite surprised they still have some plants because they're 9 months old now and I expected them to turn over all the plants in no time at all. However, they've been quite respectful and I think they're about half the size of Hoods. But yeah, they're getting along quite well.
Yeah, I want to say to be continued regarding the plants because I've heard that the plants do not stand a chance once the colony grows big enough. But how many times have you tried keeping this species?
This is my second attempt as well. Basically, I had pretty much the same story as Hood had. Although my queen, she came with mites and I didn't even end up taking her out the tube in the end. And I did actually manage to get rid of the mites, but it was too late and she collapsed.
Oh, yeah. So for all those listening out there, if you're just getting a Carebara queen, make sure to check for mites. We have had 2 for 2 so far with casualties. So yeah, be aware of that. And Jake, how big do you reckon the colony is today? You said half the size of Hood, but Yeah, has it
maybe
cost?
5,000, I'd say. Because I think Hood's is at least 10,000.
And once again, what setup did they live in?
Naturalistic tank. Yeah. About 120 litres.
And what kind of, is it just regular dirt or any special dirt mix?
Well, I mostly use Antscapes, or Ryan. He has a tropical mix in his shop, so I use that mostly. And I kind of mix in a lot of rocks as well, because I've found the Carebara, they do like to nest under rocks. So if you chuck a few large rocks in there as well, they do appreciate it. Yeah.
All right. Lastly, we have Sid lastly, we also have Sid here. And Sid, what is your experience with this species?
So I had a colony of these probably approaching maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I think I got them to probably close to what Hood's colony's like now, in regards to size, maybe not quite just as big as that, because I was starting to protein control them when they got to a certain size. But from memory, they were spreading across 3 nests in an outworld. But unfortunately, during some product testing, which we'll probably you can explain a little bit later, but the entire colony was lost as a result of some testing. But yeah, so I had them for probably about 7 months, I would say, and that was from queen and a few workers, up to around about 8 to 10,000 workers within 7 months. So yeah, they're very fast growing, but that's the experience I had with them.
And was the first time you kept them, or have you tried before?
Well, that particular colony, it's a hard one to say, because obviously, being the store, having multiple ones passing through, the reason that queen actually was kept is because in quarantine she was found with mites. So I just thought, well, what I'll do, I'll try and keep her as a personal colony and just see how it panned out. And luckily, I think originally she had maybe 50 workers, and there was a bunch of mites on them and things. And the queen had a few mites on her. And over sort of some time, while they were in the nest, the workers just died with the mites. And thankfully, the mites also died out. And eventually, over the course of a sort of few weeks, the mite infestation cleared itself up. So and then she just went on to flourish.
Yeah, I must say I'm very impressed for how many mites attacks we've had. So I've also kept the Carebara Diversa, but I lost my colony due to mites. So that is 4 for 4 with mites problems. So yeah, definitely something to look very closely at when you get your colony to see if they have any mites. That has been a little bit of an introduction to all of the panelists, and we'll now move into the general and facts about Carebara Diversa. So the first question is, where are they found and where are they considered native? And Carebara Diversa are native to Asia, although when I did a little bit of research, they were also somehow in Australia, which I didn't quite understand, but it must be another marauder ant species, since Google said both things. But yeah, they are considered native in Asia, and that is most of the countries around that area. And the temperature, I don't know if you guys have heard anything about this, where they live.
Well, I've heard that the temperature, and a lot of the care guides say temperature is quite high, around 28 degrees, if memory serves. I'm not doing that at the moment. I'm not sure what the other chaps kept theirs at. I'm keeping mine at 25 degrees. And initially, I expected when they found it that they would grow quicker than they did. But as you can tell, recently in the past couple of months, they've exploded. So I think where I'm keeping them at 25 is good, and is not running the risk of cooking them. More importantly.
And what kind of humidity would you guess you are having?
No idea. I'm keeping them in they do like humidity. They like it quite high anyway. Hence why I'm using, I'm not doing this because Wakushi's here. I'm not a Wakushi fanboy, as it were, but his MS series are really good at holding on to the humidity. And I'm keeping them in there, and I'm watering it maybe once a week just to keep the humidity topped up, and it seems to be working. As you can see from my videos, my colony's doing really well. So they do like high humidity. What it actually is, I don't generally keep track of that. I just trust the nests that I've got them in.
Yeah, I must say, the more experience I've got, I've started to also just trust the nest a lot more than looking at the numbers. Jake, what temperature are you keeping your colony at?
Well, it's kind of hard to tell, to be honest. I've got basically at the minute 2 large heat mats under the whole tank, but the kind of the top temperature can vary. Some days it's as low as like 9 degrees, and other
Wow.
days it's up to 25. But I do think they're just kind of sitting at the bottom of the tank when it is cold, and because I'm guessing it's still kind of quite warm down there. But mostly they just manage it themselves, to be honest. But when it is that cold, I won't see them in the outworld. They all hide away deep down underground.
So is there a sweet spot for when they're the most active, or is it just the hotter it is, the
Oh.
more active they get?
Well, I think anything past about 21 degrees and they start kicking off then. Yeah, and then it kind of goes up and up and up. And I'd say anything past about 26, it's kind of peak kind of everything, like activity, if you get what I mean.
Yeah. What about humidity? Of course, it's quite hard to ask that when you have a naturalistic setup, but how often are you watering the setup?
It depends, to be honest. They've had quite a rough little life in their tank, because at one point it had a water feature and basically managed to fill the whole tank with about 2 inches of water at least. And the soil is only maybe about 3 inches high. So everything in there was completely saturated. And yeah, they did absolutely fine through that. All the plants died, everything else died, but the Carebara kind of managed to hold on. And then I didn't water it then for, it was about 2 or 3 months maybe. And yeah, they didn't seem to mind at all as well. I kind of dried it completely out, and but they've kept ploughing on just fine.
Did you then give them a water source in that kind of drought?
Semi, but they didn't really seem to kind of take it that much. Then they never seemed too interested in their water sources.
That's interesting. I mean, yeah, it's of course when you're drying your ants out, it's very important to give them a water source so they can do something. Sid, what kind of temperature have you kept your colony at?
So when I had them, they're in. So all the personal colonies are in a heated room, and that typically varies depending on summer and winter, and it would probably range anything from around about 20 to 27. But I'd say typically it hangs mostly around 23, 24, 25. You know, depending on the time of day. That's typically the sort of most temperatures. The most likely temperatures that they were hanging around at. So, I think 24 and the growth rate was very, very good on that. So, I would probably say, with the fact that looking at Hood's growth, my growth was about the same, that really sort of an ambient temperature of around about around 24, 25 is probably the ideal peak environment. I suppose that would be what I would say.
And what about humidity? Did you have any trackers, or was it just like?
No, well, it's just the same as Hood. Really, it was just a hydration top up. I didn't use any liquid feeders or anything in the setups. There was literally nothing at all. The only water source they had would have been drinking from the gypsum when it was hydrated. So the setup I used was literally mirroring Hood's setup, where it was the 2 of the 5.5 MS5.5 units, but I originally started them in an MS3.5, and then just kind of added a new nest on each time. So it seemed like when they were getting the first few months, they filled out the first nest, and then after that, it was nearly adding a new nest every month with the rate of growth. So, so it was. It's very much, my setup was very much like Hood's is now.
All right. So next question is, do they hibernate? And as far as I've researched, they don't hibernate. I know that there's a few Asian species like Campanodus nicorensis that may slow down and go into somewhat of a diapause during winter. But as far as I'm aware, I have not seen any people say that they directly need to hibernate. I don't know if you guys have heard anything about that.
No, it's not something I've experienced with mine either. In the year that I've had them, I got them last November, had them through the summer, and I've obviously got them now, obviously. I've not noticed any drop off in brood production or anything like that. So I've not noticed any kind of diapause at all or anything like that.
All right. What about red darkness? What about keeping them in the dark? Of course, some species can be very light tolerant and other species don't care at all. Sid, did you keep your colony in the dark or in a red light or just out in the open?
Right. So, well, this is a bit of a sensitive topic for me because I'm a firm believer of ants will get used to lighting. So, in testing I've done with black light, red light, and no shield, the results I got were all the same. So I've kind of just, it was some of the testing I did with the Saturns to determine whether or not they needed to have some, was it quite important? And I tested it with some very mythically light sensitive species, things like Mesa, where a lot of people say that they need to be kept in the dark. And it turns out, a lot of people were kind of, well, this is just from my opinion anyway, that I think a lot of the times people think that they might be light sensitive is because when they lift the lid, people think that they're freaking out and scattering because they're sensitive to light, when in theory, which in fact it's actually the vibrations of removing the lid is what sets them off. I ran the test of basically keeping having them in a dark room and then flat turning on a bright light right in front of them, and the colony doesn't flinch. But the second that the setup is touched, they freak out. So I think that. So my answer when it comes to red light, no light, my answer will always be the same. Of really, that being said, I did have a red shield on mine. Purely because they had them in there, and I don't think that ants prefer having no light, having a lid off. But I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference to colonies' growth. I think they just get used to it. But I did use a red shield with those at the time.
I think there's some merit to that as well. I think just about every ant keeper has noticed that at periods of time, ants in artificial setups will move brood into the outworld. I mean, I'm looking at my meat ants now, and they've got a load of brood in the outworld, which is obviously exposed to light, and it's been like that for a little while now. I think it's not observed in nature very often, but I think it's more in this. In fact, at all, I've never ever seen an ant colony put larvae, pupae, anything like that outside of their nest for any reason. So I understand what Wakushi's saying that light might not be a biggest factor as what people may think. I think it's quite evident with his Saturn nests that he's got out that have no light shielding at all, that ants still do fine in there. Personally, I still prefer to keep mine under a red filter. Call me traditionalist if you wish, and my messes I prefer to keep in a blackout nest as well. But like I said, that's probably me being more traditionalist than it is anything else.
So have you kept your Carebara in the red then?
Yeah, my Carebara I've kept in a red filter, and I've got no intentions to change that, to be honest. Because, I've got no intentions to change it. I'll probably keep them like that.
I mean, I can respect that. And I can also say that for all who's interested in hearing a little bit more of our thoughts or the Ant Pod, the regular crew, you can hear Pod 30, which is all about the best conditions to keep ants in, where we also go over this topic of light/vibration. The Carebara Diversa have nuptial flights only in April, which I found a little bit weird, but that may be also just where they have been observed to fly, at least in the website I've looked on. But they do have the nuptial flights kind of early year, but also as it is an Asian species, they may just fly a little bit all year long. But as far as I can see online, they only fly in April, which I find a little bit hard to believe. And the last general question is, do the ants sting or spray acid? And no, the ants do neither spray acid or sting. The thing that can make them a little bit unkid safe is due to them having quite big majors, or at least super majors, when the colony is a little bit older. But again, if you just don't let your kids put your hands in there, I would consider the species kid safe. What do you guys think, Sid? Would you say this is a kid safe species?
I wouldn't recommend them for kids purely because of the growth. The fact that if they do grow large and they escape, they're marauder ants. They will hunt down other colonies. They will wipe them out. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend them as kid safe. And due to the nature of their numbers, they're very swarmy. And if you are putting hands in, even just ignoring the majors, even though the actual workers are so tiny, now they're really, really small ants, and they're really thin ants as well. So they're not sort of chunky, but they have a hell of a bite. Getting bitten by one of them feels much the same as really a meat ant in a lot of ways. So they've got a real strong jaw about them, even the little workers. So if you get quite a lot of them on your hand, it can be quite it can be a little bit not painful, but for a kid it could be. So I wouldn't recommend them just because of the cost of the setups. If you are keeping them in artificial, they need a lot of expansion. If you're keeping them in natural, their growth rates become very challenging to deal with. They're very challenging to move. So I would say that these are definitely expert level adult keeper ants.
And this is why we have the panel, because it's always good to have a little bit of information. Once you have seen a big colony, you respect the big colony a lot more than when you just have a small colony. Do you guys have anything to add? Are you agreeing with Sid, or?
Yeah, I'd 100% agree with what Sid said. Like, I don't think a kid, they definitely not match up well, just because they grow so fast, and to be able to afford them, you just can't really do that as a kid. Yeah.
They're also very, very sensitive. I mean, not saying that, kids couldn't keep sensitive ants, but they're very challenging to raise. They're not easy during the founding stages. They have a very high mortality rate. They have extremely, if not the highest rate of mite infestations that suppliers will get, because naturally in the wild, there's a lot of different theories and stuff, but where they may be the type of ants that have to regularly relocate to avoid mite egg infestations hatching, so they keep moving nests and things like that. So there's but I've never known any ant be more infected with mites than Diversa. So that's another factor as well. They're very sensitive, very very hard to raise, and have a very high risk of mites in general.
Yeah, I think it's quite evident with four of us, have kept Carebaras, and all of us have experienced mites.
Yeah,
it is a very common issue, and they are quite a mobile ant in the wild. And like Sid alluded to, it could be because they're moving away to get away from mite infestations. A lot of people say it's because they're dirty, messy ants, and they keep dirty nests and stuff. But from my observations, from my ones, when the nest was too big, yes, they did put rubbish in that, but when they needed to expand and get bigger, they moved it out into the outworld. Yeah. So and the nest that I've got now, there is quite a bit of space in there at the moment, because I recently put an expansion on with another MS 5.5, but they're not filling that full of rubbish. So I think that hypothesis that they're messy in their nests is not a true reflection. When it comes to the setups and if they're kid friendly as well, I've got very much share the opinion of Jake and Wakushi on this, that they're not kid friendly. The bites don't, as Sid alluded to, the minors don't overly hurt, but when you've got a lot of them on you, as I did in my last video, for example, it does become kind of painful and uncomfortable. I've not been bitten by a super major yet, or a larger one, one of the larger majors yet, but I imagine that they've got quite strong jaws compared if the small ones hurt that much. And like people said, it's the expansion of them as well, the growth rate you have to keep up with. They're not a cheap species. I think they average around 60-70 pounds to buy with a queen and a load of workers. But you need good quality outworlds and good quality nests to keep them contained. And with their growth rate, the money starts mounting up. I've got 3 nests and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 outworlds attached to them at the moment, with a lot of tubing to expand, as it were, to make the illusion that they've got a lot more space than they actually have with the extra tubing that I've got. And I think any kid that might be buying ants products with their pocket monies or something like that hasn't got a slush fund of money to support these ants, they will struggle, and then they might come a cropper, because as Sid alluded to, they are aggressive ants and they will actively hunt out other colonies and destroy them. And I've known a couple of people tell me that's happened to them when they've kept them. This is why I'm trying to keep on top of their expansion by giving them loads of outworlds and stuff to stop that need to try and get out and find more food.
Right. This was a lot more inside knowledge than I expected, and I just want to say thank you to all 4. Sid, you're the only one who has had a mite infestation and survived. Do you have any tips for how to deal with the mites?
Well, in that scenario, it was just really a case of I have a belief that there wasn't too many of them. It wasn't a massive infestation, but I definitely saw some of the workers on there, and I think pretty much what happened was they think they had around about 50 workers, and then it seemed like over the course of around a week, this obviously was a long time ago, so I'm just trying to remember it, but I remember them dying back down to about 10 workers, and I think that the 10 workers kind of removed the workers that had mites on them. And I remember when it went down to about 10 workers, I didn't really see any mites anymore. And I think that because they were in a very very artificial setup, there was no soil or any substrate for eggs to be laid on. There was no sort of trash waste or anything by them, because I'd been very I didn't even have an outworld connected at this time. So the way in which I raised them was just having an MS35 nest with I think it was about 5 centimeters of tube connected to it, with just plugged with some cotton wool, and they used to just bring their trash to the end of the tube, and I used to feed them, like a chopped half mealworm through the end of the tube, and then the workers would drag the food in, and then they would put the trash back at the end of that tube. So I think just as a result of the mites not having an opportunity to breed or lay any eggs, I think they eventually just died out. And then just going forward, I think that was pretty much the case. So I think that with mites and substrate, it becomes very difficult, because the mites have that breeding ground, and the majority of mites they have a kind of egg cycle, and I'm not too sure the time frame, but I imagine it's probably like most, which are usually around about 28 days. So it's why you can sometimes notice, like with grain mites, if you regularly clean outworlds, you don't notice them. But if a trash pile has been in there and it's got damp, sort of decaying food, mites can start to breed, and they usually boom out of it in massive numbers after about sort of 3-4 weeks or so. But yeah, so in that scenario, I just think that the mites just died out through a lack of opportunity of being able to breed, and thankfully they weren't in big numbers. So yeah, that was pretty much the experience in that regards. But I didn't use any high-priced smiles or anything like that at the time, because to be honest, I didn't really have much hope for the queen, because I'd not really heard many scenarios where if they've got mites, they can kind of recover from it. But in that scenario, they did, and I actually had another colony of a Finis, Carebara Diversa, 2 queen, which also had mites, did the same setup, and it was an exact repeat of the same scenario. So they also recovered from mites, doing the same thing. That colony was then actually sold, because I didn't need both of them.
Yeah. So we have, of course, also done a mite episode a while back. I can't remember the exact number, but we've also done a discussion about that. The most common way is lemon, although lemon is something I personally wouldn't recommend because I've heard just as much bad as good. But generally, what I've also gotten the feel of after having my mite problem is as long as you just keep up on removing the food, you should have a good chance of fighting against the mites or using mite kill mites such as hypernastic miles. I want to say thank you to the Wild Martin for letting us use some of his thumbnail pictures. So if you like the picture you clicked on to hear this podcast, all credit goes to the Wild Martin. So thank you very much. And with that, it's now time to hear all of the very juicy parts. What are the secrets to how your colonies have grown? How much do you feed them? It's time to go into the species-specific questions. And Hood, you are currently muted, but what is the best way to found the species and grow them large?
Well, I think they are quite protein hungry. The queen produces a lot of eggs in quite a short period of time. So for me, it's making sure if you want a big colony, plenty of protein for them. It's a good way of controlling it, as Sid alluded to earlier. It's a good way of controlling it by controlling the amount of protein you give them, but feed them a lot. They do like their sweet stuff, but I would recommend that if you do that you give them jelly pots, because I've used the liquid feeders on them, and every time they just put rubbish in it, which breaks the seal, so it leaks everywhere, and it's very messy and very sticky. So I would use jelly pots as well. That's a top tip from me, to be fair.
And how did you found them from the test tube? Did you move them into a... I must say that I have not heard the way of founding before was using a nest and just using a tube as an outward. But Hood, how did you go? What is your history of how they ended up like they are today?
The test tube that they were in, they started to run out of water, so I made the decision to move them into an MS 3.5. At the time, they only occupied about a third of that nest, and because I was expecting quite a big growth, I didn't think it was a massive issue. And like I said before, they did then move rubbish into it, but as they got bigger, they moved that rubbish back out again. So, yeah, I did... Normally, that I'll be more comfortable with. I did move them quite quickly because of the test tube situation, into a nest. But as you can see with my colony now, it wasn't detrimental to them, and they've done fine with it.
All right, Jake, you have a naturalistic setup. Did you just move them straight into a naturalistic setup when you got them, or what is your history from start to now?
Well, I think I got my queen in maybe March, although beforehand, I think she was a 2021 queen. She must have been, well, maybe from April 2021. But I got her about 150 workers from Antantics. So they'd obviously nurtured her on quite well. And she was just in a test tube, but it seemed to be doing her well. And yeah, I had absolutely no problems with her in the test tube for a few weeks, and then I just put her straight into the big naturalistic tank. Pretty much, I got a pencil, jabbed a little hole in it just as a pilot hole, and they ended up going straight down it. And yeah, that's it.
So it was just a massive naturalistic setup, or did you upgrade over time?
Well, I started with a small triangular pot. And I had the other tank ready to go, but I thought, no, I'll keep them in the little pot for a bit, just because they're small still. And that worked out good. And then eventually they did start kind of pushing the limits. So I thought, all right, then, and just put the pot straight into the naturalistic setup. And after a few weeks, they moved out of their pot and made their own little nest in the kind of main tank area.
All right. And would you say you have any tips for the best way to found the species?
Just make sure you give them a lot of food, to be honest. I think you just got to keep the food going in and coming out as well. So don't leave any food in there for any time at all, because you just want to minimize that mite risk. Yeah. And if you've got access to the hypoaspis mites, you can just chuck them in, even if it doesn't look too bad. Like I do, it never hurts, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, in the naturalistic setup, they may start hunting the springtails, but generally, if it is a mite, it's a species known to get mites often. I would also recommend, if you are looking out for buying some hypernastic miles, why not dump a little bit in there?
Hi, it's Succeed from Pormore Art. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ant Pod, and please visit my ant and spider shop at www.pormoreart.ca. We're a Canadian business shipping ant and spider keeping supplies worldwide, specializing in test tube accessories and a variety of hybrid formicaria, glass outrolls, and enclosures. Enjoy the show.
Sid, what way have you founded your species and grown them?
Well, in that scenario, the reason I didn't keep them in a test tube was because of the mites. So one of the issues with test tubes is if a colony has mites, the cotton becomes basically the perfect breeding ground for the mites to lay eggs and reproduce, because it just meets all the requirements of, if the test tube is kept at the temperature, obviously for the ants, it's kept at the perfect temperature for the mites to breed in, and then you have that humidity requirement and dampness that again is perfect for mites. So it's why I think a lot of people, they may receive ants, and it's very difficult for stores to quarantine them because of the long lifespan of the eggs. Or the cycle of eggs, that you can have, a colony of Diversa arrive and it would look mite free, but what's happening is there could be a load of mite eggs in the cotton or in the substrate. It's one of the things to really be careful of is if ants ever arrive in a tube with soil or substrate, if that soil was collected from where they originally came from, there's a very good chance that will also contain mite eggs. So I think it's just a trait that has, where they collected from, because a lot of the larger colonies, they're wild collected and not sort of raised from queens. And when they're often collected, dirt is scooped up with them, as well as, mite eggs and stuff that I'm guessing they're surrounded by in the wild. So yeah, the thought process was just to get them out of a test tube and get them straight into in a nest. In my logical mind, I was thinking that gypsum's a very bad breeding ground for mites because of the swings in humidity. So I made a point of letting the humidity drop down very low to the point where the gypsum would almost be at a point of nearly drying out, in which case that would pull any moisture out of that the eggs would require in the hope of maybe killing them. Whether that worked or not, I don't know. All I know is that it thankfully the mites disappeared in those scenarios, and but they stuck to one corner of the nest in a little chamber, and I guess it was no real difference than just being underground in a chamber and just founding away. It was just a clutch of eggs, and they had their little waste ground. They're pretty good actually at getting rid of waste, and thankfully they weren't putting the waste in the nest. They were actually putting it down the tube, so it made cleaning them out very easy in that scenario. So yeah, but just a little bit of life, just half a mealworm. I think I gave that to them maybe just under once a week when they were small, and then just sort of scaled it up. And I think when they got to around about 100 workers, I think I added an outworld around that point, and then from there it just rocketed off.
All right. So Hood, you've already told a little bit of why you chose to go with an artificial setup. Jake, why did you choose to go with a naturalistic setup?
Well, it just seemed what everyone had done, to be honest. And I had a massive tank, and where it just seemed a match made in heaven, to be honest. Although straight after, I saw Hoods in a kind of, what do you call it, a synthetic setup or not natural setup, and I did regret it a little bit, kind of moving them into it. However, I think long term, like now, it's like I think it was all right.
Yeah,
but it was kind of just following everyone else, to be honest.
Yeah, so of course it is quite a, like Hood also mentioned in the beginning, quite a lot of saying you cannot found them in artificial. You need this naturalistic setup. I don't quite know where this has come from. If it's kind of to deal with the mites, if that's the reason why they are a lot more successful in a naturalistic setup, because mites maybe are harder to find the ants, or maybe because the protein and the ants are separated. I'm not too sure. But Sid, why did you choose to go with the artificial setup?
Well, I just don't have the space for artificial. I love artificial setups, but
Gotcha.
natural. I love natural setups. I just suck at making them though. I can't. I'm not like Ryan. I don't have the eye for scaping and all this cool stuff. And not only that, you're just generally, because of the nature of the ants that they are, being a swarming species, when any of those types of ants tend to grow to big numbers, they will just absolutely just decimate any plant life. They'll turn over dirt. It's just really difficult to make a really nice. So it just ends up being a tank of dirt. And for me, I love to witness and study ants. So it was just not really an option for me. I would rather try and just see if it was possible to make nests work, because I want to see all the stuff going on in the nest. And I think that to really study and learn from ants, it's a requirement, because natural setups, you just wouldn't see a lot of the stuff. I mean, I learned loads from keeping them. It's some of their behaviors, some of their habits, the way that the way in which the super majors work with having multi roles. It's just really interesting stuff. But you'll only see that in a nest. You wouldn't unfortunately see that in natural setups. Even the way that they feed, a lot of it's hidden with that species. Unfortunately, they don't do much above ground apart from just forage, and they it's a requirement for them to get food into the nest. They like, I'll touch on that later, but yeah, it's an absolute requirement for them to take food back to the nest rather than consume it outside. So just really for a lot of reasons, but mostly product testing and things as well. And I think some of the reasons why they may have not previously worked in nests is because they're obviously ground dwelling species, and I think it's really important for them to have a kind of environment that replicates that. And in the MS nest, I think they worked well because such a big gypsum block, it very much replicates being underground through the amount of humidity and even through the fact that it works as a water drinking source as well when it's hydrated. So I think for those reasons is why it may have worked. Whereas a lot of other nests, I don't think it'd be possible to make acrylic work. I just don't think they'd get the humidity requirements, or maybe even just the water sources. I mean, it's very difficult, unfortunately, because of the size of the workers to use, because they bury everything. So trying to use a liquid feeder or something would be just a no-go. They would just absolutely bury it under substrate or with debris and things, because they're one of those kind of types of species where if anything's a hazard, they just bury it. So if you try and put sugar in there, they'll bury it. They'll put liquids anywhere in the outlet, they'll bury it. So yeah, it's I think that might be one of the reasons why not many people used nests, and they went with the natural.
Yeah,
I will. Oh, sorry. If you don't mind me cutting in and adding something there. Obviously, with mine being an artificial setup, I do give them extra water in a test tube. Now, I make sure there's an air pocket in behind the test tube cotton wool, so the cotton wool doesn't get sucked down into the test tube. But they do drink from that. They do drink it quite readily as well. So using a test tube right over a liquid feeder is a viable option for them when it comes to water. And yet again, Sid's very right. Whenever they have a tendency to bury stuff as well. But I've noticed with the jelly pots that when they have put debris on top of it, they still mine past that debris and still get the sweet jelly stuff for them. So those two methods of water and carbohydrates in an artificial setup is ideal because they both work really well.
All right. So I think also what we've also touched a little bit upon is why they don't really do that good in artificial nest in general. It's because the good thing with gypsum is it can create such a high humidity area, and that's what this species really needs. And if you have something like an acrylic nest with a sponge system, a sponge needs a lot more hydration and it dries out a lot quicker. And you may need to water it every day to get the same results as a simple gypsum block. And that may be why we also touched about before that you tend to go with a naturalistic setup because everything is just a lot more moist. Now, you said before that we are going to go into it a little bit later, but I think it's time now to talk about it because the best nest to use them in is this kind of artificial gypsum nest or a naturalistic setup. But what did you do with that prototype that went so horribly wrong that the colony died?
So what I was trying to do, so at the time I was struggling with space. So what I tried to do was try and find a way I could make a kind of it's difficult obviously without displaying it, but I tried making like a multi-floor nest so that they would have to kind of slalom up some hole, like it was multi-leveled and then it had a hole going through the floor, to above. So they'd have to kind of go up these sort of snaking holes and then go across and then snake all the way back down the other side. And there were big chambers. None of it was hydrated. It was a dry sort of kind of more like a maze, but it would just give them a big amount of space that they could use as nesting area before they got to the outworld. And I sat it between the nests and between the outworld. And the idea was to have it, it was completely, it was see-through, so you could, it was clear clear acrylic at the back and the front, and you could see into it, and it was kind of, I thought that would work really well. But I then later realized that I hooked it up and I gave them their usual feeding, and I used to feed mine 1 or 2 Morio worms. So the super worms, they absolutely love those. What they did is they swarmed them in the outworld. And typically what they used to do is they would, the way Diversa work, they are very tremendous in the way in which they work together. And they're very grippy as ants. And they would swarm a prey and they would all kind of create a net amongst themselves. And they grab hold of rocks and debris and substrate, whatever they can. And they will use the surrounding to work as like extra weight to pin the prey down. And if it's a very strong prey, in the case of superworms being quite strong, they would recruit. So they have a couple of workers. So as soon as they engage prey, they're very good at sizing up whether or not this is going to be a challenge for them. And typically the super majors will stay in the nests almost all the time. Because they do work as repletes. Their gases swell, and they tend to, from when I had them, appear like they are almost containing a yellow liquid. But they kind of triple in size from when they're sort of born. And but when they have tough prey, the workers will rush into the nest, and you'll see them. It'll be about 3 or 4 of them, and they obviously must release some pheromone, because as they're running into the nest, it's almost like they're screaming, like "Get out and help!" Because there's just all the workers and all the supers that they pass along the way, and they do a full run all the way into the to the deepest part of the chambers in the furthest part of the nest, and there will just be this insane swarm, and I mean like the near enough 3/4 of the nest within 30 seconds has just emptied out into the outworld, and they will just swarm this prey, and the supers will be there with their big jaws, to try and crush, heads or pin down or whatever it is to try and immobilize the prey. But the workers will swarm that, and then what they will do is when the prey is kind of either too tired or dispatched or killed or whatever it is, they will all work together and lift it into the nests. They'll drag it into the tube and they'll haul it all the way into the inner part of the nest. And then that's when, the supers and the smaller workers will start to eat. And they only do it when they get it into the nest. And what I think went wrong with the setup was they pulled the prey into the nest, into the very first chamber. But they were unable to then lift it up to the next level, because in that particular prototype, because the ants could travel up vertically, I didn't really worry about it, but I didn't think that they would have to lift prey up there as well. So they struggled with that. And as a result, they weren't able to get the superworms into the nest part. So what they did is they just left them, and they didn't attempt to eat them. They just left them there. So I'd gave them their usual weekly feeding, and then when I'd come back to check on them, 5 days, a week later, to give them the next feeding, I noticed this tremendous mound, and it's like a mountain of black. And I'd lost about 90%, maybe 95% of the small workers in just that week. And I think this was over a summer, so it may have been a combination of the fact that they'd not had their feeding, which may have supplied them with some hydration, and it was time for their hydration at that point anyway. But it was just out of nowhere, this huge mountain of workers just died off. And I thought, well, okay, that went catastrophically wrong. I kind of looked, saw the food not taken into the nest, and they'd not eaten it. The superworms were still there intact. So if they cannot get the food into the nest, they just starve, which I found very, very interesting. But it must be a behavioural thing, and this may or may not be true, and for everyone, I don't know. This is just what happened in my scenario. That I lost so many of the small minor workers. And I thought, well, okay, thankfully I've not lost the entire colony. But what I was left with was approximately about 150 super majors and about 100 minor workers. And I thought, well, okay, all the hope is not lost. Took away the problematic prototype, connected everything back up like it was like normal. And things just carried on going downhill. I fed them, they took food in. They weren't consuming it like they were before. They ate some, it started deteriorating, and just had a lot of problems from that point. And I think what was happening was the super majors were consuming too much of the resources. And because the super majors don't really go out and forage. And I think that the problem was that the super majors were just taking up so much of the colony resources that there was no brood being produced. Things just went really wrong, and eventually the colony, just over the course of a couple of months, just deteriorated to the point where, unfortunately, they went down to, well, I'd lost those 100 remaining workers after about a couple more weeks, and I was just left with nearly super majors, and that was where I think the problem. What I probably should have done was separate the super majors out of there and leave the 100 workers with just the queen. Because I think that was where it went wrong. I lost those minor workers, and I was left for a few months with just 3-4 workers and massive amounts of super majors. So yeah, just one thing to kind of learn from that. It's critical for them to be able to get proteins directly into the nest.
Yeah, and of course this may not be the same for everyone, like you also said. But it's definitely worth, if you're thinking of getting a vertical nest, that this could happen. Of course, if they can't drag it into the nest part of the vertical nest, it may not happen. But it's definitely a good story to have in mind, and it's a story that certainly sets something going in your head. But you talked a lot about these superworms. Is that what you would recommend people should feed Carebara Diversa?
Well, I fed them originally on to small mealworms. I gave them all types, really, to be honest. Crickets, superworms. Superworms was just an option I found that very interesting to watch them and study them with the superworms because of the sheer strength of them. I always found it so impressive to watch them and study how they use the environment to basically pin down. And you just kind of, you really think about it. The size of that superworm to the workers, it's almost like it's like if anyone's seen the Avengers when the Hulk takes on that massive worm thing at the end of the Avengers Assemble, and that's the size comparison, and but it's like a human taking that down, but they're all working together, and they manage it, and so. It was nice to see the natural behavior of them. So for me, a big favorite was the superworms, but you need a big colony to start doing that. You've got to really be over 1,000 workers. But before that, it was mealworms, and then occasionally I do the crickets as well.
All right, Jake, what is your? Do you have anything you've seen them react better to or not react to at all? What would you recommend feeding?
Well, honestly, they'll eat anything, in my opinion. If it's protein, like I've chucked in like mice. I've chucked in pretty much every feeder insect that I could get my hands on, and they've eaten everything. The only issues I've ever had with them is the jelly pots, but I think that's because I've got a naturalistic setup, but they normally go moldy quite fast, and because they bury them, it happens extra fast because the soil is dirty, kind of thing. But yeah, they'll literally eat any sort of protein I've found, like steak as well. I had PJ saying feed your ants steak, so it was and went a load of steak and they devoured that.
Yeah, that's cool. What about you, Hood? Have you anything you would recommend feeding?
Yeah, I just want a quick question to Antimatter, if that's okay. How do you give them their
That's right.
carbohydrates? How do you feed them that if they bury the jelly pots? And I'm assuming they'll bury the liquid feeders as well.
Well, I don't give them the jelly pots much, but when I do, I try to keep them upright, and it stops them for a little bit burying it. However, like water, I don't give them any really anymore because they just bury it so fast.
Is that then your carbohydrate source, the once in a while jelly pots?
Not really. I think most of the time I just give them the odd little squeeze of sugar snaps, but I don't really think they need much sugar.
I mean, they
don't really care. Like
the entire lifespan of mine, I never gave them a single drop of sugars or carbs or anything. It was just protein. For 7 months, they were just continually growing like mad, and there was next to no, dead workers as a result. So carbs is not an essential. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't take it and it doesn't benefit them, but it's not a requirement whatsoever. You can do away with sugars with Diversa.
Right. I guess if you're depending on what your feeder animals eat, there may be some fruit sugar, or they may get a little bit of the carbohydrates from whatever you feed them. But It's definitely worth thinking about. Hood, what do you feed your ant?
Yes. Sorry, I did go off on a massive tangent on that one.
No worries.
Question I wanted to ask. I feed mine. Majority of my feeding's been dubia roaches. I feed them. That's what I feed them mostly. But like Sid, I have given them Mario worms because I do incapacitate my Mario worms to make sure that they can't bite and stuff because I cut through their head. But because of their nervous system, they still frail around a lot. And then, like Sid said, I've noticed that when they have got a really active prey still, then the larger. I've not had any of my super majors come out yet because they just lurk in the nest, as Sid said. But the much larger majors and possibly the smaller groups of super majors do come out and lend a hand. So observing it wise, Mario worms are really good for that. I've also, like Antimatters, I've not filmed it and put it in a video yet, but I have fed them 2 pinkies twice now, and they absolutely destroy that and leave nothing left behind, taking bones and everything. But I will slightly say something different to what Sid said about his experimental setup, because I have put food in my other outworlds, which is connected by a long bit of tubing, and they have hollowed out that food and taken it to the nest. So, not saying what Sid would say was wrong because these are his observations, but I have noticed from my observations that they will take the food. If they can't get it in the tubings, they will hollow it out. For example, if it's got an exoskeleton like a cricket or a small locust, I'm looking at now, they've hollowed that out completely and obviously fed it to the workers in the nest or the larvae in the nest. And I've also, in the most furthest of the 4 for the outworlds, I've got the honey pot in there as well. Not honey pot, jelly pot in there, and they've excavated all of that and moved it to the nest as well. So they will move it. I don't know if what happened with SIDS was correlation with food or not, or just a situation that the colony was going through.
Was that food cut open?
Yeah, I always kill food.
I mean, that could have possibly been the difference because they may not have been able to get into the actual superworms in my scenario because they were fully intact. So it was a long time ago, and I just put it down to the fact I didn't really delve too deep into it because I just knew that it didn't work because they couldn't get them up. It could have been also a combination of maybe the supers couldn't get to it either because of the factor. So it's either they couldn't get it in to the super majors or the super majors couldn't get it. But I think that they lacked possibly the ability to break into the exoskeleton And that might have been the reason why, because if it had been a pinky, they probably would have been able to just chew through the soft skin and get it into the nest. There was a lot of reason, a lot of things, and that's not really too much to pay attention to, I think, because it was primarily just the prototype that was tested. I always test things on my own personal colonies to ensure that I'm not putting anyone's colonies at risk. So that was just, one of many things that I tested, and it was my biggest catastrophic fail. There could have been many factors as to why it didn't work. But just that was one observation where I just saw that for some reason, they just the worms were intact, and if they'd cut the worms open, it may not have actually happened. They may have been able to get in and do their thing. So yeah, it just might have been the reason.
But this is the good thing about this, so we can all compare how we do things and what we've observed, isn't it, to give people the better idea of what's gone on with us. But yeah, like I said, it was just my observations, what I've seen with my colonies, and I've noticed they do transport food into the nests. But like Sid said, I'm looking at them now because I fed them a dubia roach a bit ago, and they've already moved the smaller one of the two towards the tubing, trying to get it through. And they also did the same with the pinkies as well. I didn't actually see them completely move it through the tubing, but they definitely move it to the area because I do want to pull it into the nest. But they will cut it down to small pieces and transport it like any other ant would as well. But yeah, that's how I feed mine. They seem, like I said, you can see from my YouTube videos that my colony's doing really well. So yeah, but as Antimatter said, I think they'll pretty much eat anything they get the mix on, to be honest.
All right. So the next topic is a little bit hard because as far as I can feel like Sid, you have just upgraded adding more nest, Hood, you have just upgraded adding more nest, and Jake, you have literally just moved the colony itself. The question is how to move the colony, and due to none of you actually, as far as I'm aware, have actually moved the colony by letting the ants go from one nest to another, I would say this is a matter of the species like heat. And if you live, at least if you live outside where they're native and you have a colder room, I'll recommend that you heat up the new nest, and that way the colony can move towards the heat, because heat is generally move towards the heat if they are in a colder area. I don't know if you guys have any tips on how to move them, or we should just go on.
Well, I would say hydration. Just you can control most ants. You can control using humidity. So, for example, like not that I need to. I think in Diversa's case, planning is very important when if you're planning on having this colony. You have to really think ahead as to how you're going to found them, what nest you're going to move them into, because the type of setup you use has to be really future proofed, because these will blow up in less than a year. They will go from really nice manageable test tube size, and then they will be 50,000 workers possibly, if they're well cared for, in the space of a year. So and that is problematic, because that's they when they're at a stage like that, that's where they become almost unmovable. You need to, if you're in a natural setup, you try, I don't even know how I'd begin to move 50,000 workers into I guess it's just a case of a bigger tank and somehow dig up the dirt and hope you don't damage the queen, because it's really difficult to do that type of stuff. And I mean, artificial, it makes it easier because you can just connect more nests, so it's not the end of the world. But moving them, if they're smaller, sort of when they're like 500 workers and you need to move them, then you just stop hydrating one nest and you hydrate the other, and they'll relocate. That's a pretty straightforward way of moving them.
Yeah, it's a good thing with having a species that both require heat and humidity. It makes everything a little bit easier compared to stubborn ants like Nigers who can just stay home. Hood, you unmuted. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I didn't find them too difficult to move when I wanted them out of the test tube, but I think it's also worth bearing in mind they're quite a mobile species as well. So in the natural world, they do move nests quite a fair bit, be it for food requirements or what. So they're not the hardest to move ever when it comes to moving them. But I think, if memory serves, I just used light because they're in my room, which is heated 25 degrees. I don't apply any extra heat to them. So I just made sure the nest was hydrated, as Sid alluded to, and just put light directly on the test tube, and then they moved. So I think they moved fairly quickly as well. So it wasn't a major drama for me.
Right. Well, I feel like we need to ask you, Jake, do you have any plans for them moving in the future, or are you just expecting them to be their forever home?
Well, I've kind of got a plan for that, but basically I'm going to drill in. I've got the 24mm drill bit, and I'm just going to drill into the tank and basically pipe it off to another whole tank. And when they want to, they'll be able to kind of move house basically whenever they like. And eventually I'd like to have like 3 setups and see what happens. And they can kind of hop between them though. And
Yeah.
Can I ask you a quick question, please, matey? Do you know when you moved them in the naturalistic, because you had that triangular small setup, when you put them in the large tank, did you disturb it, put it on its side or anything like that, or did you just plonk it in and they moved of their own accord?
I literally just plonked it in and let them do it themselves. Yeah.
That's smart. But also, I just remembered that Rich or Ansex, they actually had a similar setup. They had a naturalistic setup, and what they did was they put a lid on it, and they drilled a hole, and they kind of made this tank go from a naturalistic tank to just being a big nest. We are getting towards the end. I don't know if there's any specific thing you want to add, but are there any things you would recommend to do or not do, Jake?
Well, I guess we're going to have to hit on the point that I think you can add new queens into your colony. So, because the queens only last 2 years, 2 or 3 years if you're lucky, you kind of got to think about, do you want to keep the colony going past that point? And if you do, you've got to start trying to introduce new queens. And I'm guessing if they fly in April, I'm guessing that's about the time of year that you want to be maybe trying to introduce a new queen. However, I'm not sure on the specifics. Not at all.
No, it's under the research and research a little bit extra. But yes, I've also heard that you can add multiple queens together even later on.
I am looking at doing that potentially, if not next season, possibly the season after, because the queens I've heard live for about 3 to 5 years. So at the 2-year point of this colony, I am looking at adding a new queen. So that might be something to watch out for in the future, because I've been told they will accept a colony. So what we normally get is a queen with a small colony. I'm hoping to attach that and see if they will merge. So wait and see, but I've heard it's possible.
All right. Sid or Hood, do you have anything to add with the do's and the don'ts?
Do you want to go first, Sid?
Rock away. I'll see what you've got to say, and then I'll add if there's anything.
Do prepare for these guys. They, like we've said before, they are difficult to found. I think just about everybody here has failed when they've tried to found them originally, be it mites or whatever. If you do get mites, don't be disheartened. Just make sure that you quarantine them appropriately, wash all your utensils and stuff, and hope they pull through. But it's very common with these ants, so don't let that dishearten you like I did me, because it took me a while to get them again. But be prepared for them. They grow very quick, so don't underestimate their growth rate. Mine stayed growing at a fairly steady pace for quite a while, and then miraculously overnight they massively expanded, and I didn't have a nest ready for them, so I had to get another one in. I've now got a nest on standby for them, ready for when they need it, because already, I don't know when I did my last video, 2 to 3 weeks ago, I can already see now that their brood has grown even more, which means they're going to be, once they hatch and they replace those brood with more brood, that I'm going to need another nest. So be prepared for quick expansion and don't underestimate them.
All right. Zip?
So, like Hood said, the founding is the hardest stage by far. I mean, with most ants it is, but especially in the case of Diversa. The things to bear in mind are their actual requirements with regards to temperature and humidity are pretty straightforward. They're not extreme, so they're actually they're really easy to keep when they get going. and don't be disheartened if you don't succeed the first time round. Maybe try something a bit different, but sometimes it is just down to the health of the queen plays a massive part. Remember that vast majority of colonies are wild caught, and as a result of that, there's all types of different parameters. It's stores try their hardest to supply healthy queens. There's a limitation of obviously what they can do. Just try and look for good reputable suppliers that, as an example, I know that Antics has really beefed up the quarantine process on things like Diversa. When I spoke to him last, he's doing pre-treatments of hypoacis miles. So, it's not an uncommon thing to get mites in them. It's just, it's unfortunately one of the downsides to that species in general. But just trying to minimize that risk when you're initially getting them, and hope for the best when it founds. But if you get them founded, after that, they're an incredibly rewarding species to keep for ant keepers. They're very challenging, but I'm sure if you speak to Hood, he will rate them very, very highly. I definitely want to keep them again, absolutely. And I really miss them for a lot of reasons, and I would definitely rate them as one of my top 5 all-time species to keep, just because they're just so interesting. There's always something to observe. They're really, really active. The growth rate, but like Hood said, a lot of preparation is required, and if you are going down a nest route, you do have to be prepared that they are not a cheap colony to house. It may change in going forward depending on what stuff's around. But yeah, but they're definitely worth the worth a lot of the hassle that you can have in the early stages. But don't be disheartened. I think you'll probably notice that a lot more people going forward will start keeping them, and hopefully that will help with the knowledge of the species in the hobby, and there'll be a lot more advice and things to do. But I think this is the nice thing with these types of care guides, is they're not like classic care guides, which is just all just kind of very basic info. This is hopefully touches on some of the do's and don'ts and what worked and what didn't work. So it's a nice sort of foundation for what people should expect.
Right. Well, I feel like we have touched upon the final question being any struggles with this species. We have touched upon foundation, founding the colony. We have touched upon mites, how they maybe can drag a lot of dirt onto their food and all of this. But is there any things we have not at all talked about? Or are you satisfied with the struggling of keeping the species?
I think we've pretty much touched most things.
Yeah, I do have one thing to add. Like just one thing that stands out from all the other ants. If you put food that kind of off the floor, kind of on a raised platform or anything like that, they will not touch it. Like they will literally just ignore it for days and days. Even if it's like cockroaches, they don't care. They just don't pick it up. Like they just will not climb.
You're going to hate me because I seem to be contradicting everybody today. Mine, I've got the main feeding area that I use is the Wakushi S5 nest. It's got the pillars at the side where you can attach platforms to feed them. I've put cockroaches on there, and I've put honey pots in them as well. And they do, because I like the trails. I love the trails. I think they're awesome. And these are very traily ants. But yeah, they do, for me, they do climb platforms and stuff to get to the food. Not to say that you're wrong. I'm just saying from my experiences. I think I've seen it on my videos as well, if you check it out.
Yeah, which platform did you use, Antimatters?
I was just using one of mine, but it could have been because of the space they've got, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, possibly.
But, yeah. But I ended up having to take the dubia roaches, put them on the floor, kind of annoy all the ants, get a few of them hitched onto it, and then I'd put it back up there. And then they do a trail, but until then they were like, no, we don't really want to inspect up here.
So do they not walk up the pillar, up the trays at all?
Some of them did, yeah, but they'd go up and they'd just be like, and then walk back down. And it's just
Interesting.
like, what are you up
Yeah.
to? Like, it was
I
like
mean-
it wasn't their territory or something, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's something to bear in mind. I think in Hood's case, I think it obviously some do, but it just might be bearing in mind that I mean, it may have been another
They may
reason.
not.
Yeah, I mean, because I had the issue where mine died out because obviously they couldn't lift them. Well, it could be because of the weight in that scenario. They did try, but I just don't think they could through the weight. But either way,
Also, and they don't climb the plants either. Like
I
they
think
will not climb my little plants.
I think all three of us would probably say that despite the challenges of them, I don't think we would change keeping them at all. I think they are entirely absolutely worth the challenges that they kind of bring along with keeping them.
No, I totally agree. I was just thinking about it when you said it before. Out of all my colonies, I think if I had to get rid of all my colonies, going to keep one, I think they'll be the ones that I keep because they're so polymorphic, meaning they have workers of different sizes. For those who didn't know the terminology, they're just so interesting. The way that they swarm the prey, the way they form the trails, they're great to look at, they're great to watch, and I absolutely love the super majors. They're just so beautiful, and because I've got them in this artificial setup, I can see the super majors in the nests and see exactly what they're doing, and they're absolutely gorgeous. Definitely,
and the way the little ones ride along, like the miners like ride on the back, which is like something special for them.
I think they're a really, really good alternative to anyone who's got a real itch for something like Geminata, because I think they're a really good replacement for Hood's Geminata. For people who want really fast, insanely fast-growing species that have that crazy swarming capability, but in some ways, obviously, they have the added advantage of super majors, which are, they're like absolute ogres. And it is funny when, like Antimatter said, they come charging and the little workers are trolling on the back of them, riding them like beasts. But yeah, they're really, really cool species.
It's like seeing out the Lord of the Rings and the Volivants.
It exactly is. I always imagine them like when in Lord of the Rings when that ogre comes bashing through the door and there's just all the little trolls riding on the shoulders, and that's it. And it is. They're quite dumb. The way that they very clumsily move around and the way that they find prey. It's almost just like they just don't know what they're doing and they rely on the little workers to guide them. They just smash.
All right. Well, I think this has been a lovely care guide. This has been a care guide about Carebara Diversa. Now, once again, I want to say thank you to all the hosts for joining. We had once more Anne's Hood, Sid from Makushi, and Jake from Antimatters. Now, all of the links to all of the hosts can be found in the description for all interested. And I want to say thank you for listening in. The Antpod releases new episodes every Wednesday and care guides every few weeks. If there's a species you want to hear about, send us a message to the Antpod Instagram. And with that, you will hear more from us at the Antpod next week.